This is an example of where pop culture comes colliding in with mathematics. So, hi, Charles. Can you discuss how meaningful Gödel's incompleteness theorems are? What are the profound philosophical implications of these proofs? It seems like these proofs speak beyond mathematics. So, Kurt Gödel and David Hilbert and Russell and Gottlob Frege and Turing and Alonzo Church and all these people, they were on a class of mathematics where they were really thinking about the foundations of mathematics. So in the 19th century and before, math, except for geometry, was on fairly shaky foundations. And it bothered the hell out of mathematicians who want to be very rigorous and very precise in what they say. And so they said, let's put mathematics on much more solid foundations. Okay, so you have definitions, axioms, things you say are true without proof. And then from those axioms, you build an entire system. So there is this concept of completeness, which says that if you write the rules down, if you have some arbitrary statement that you make in your system, we usually call it a well-formed formula. And that arbitrary statement, can you, with the things you've assumed to be true, make an assertion about that? Can you prove it? It's true or false in your system. You're complete if for all things you can write down, you can do that. Now, there's a very closely related concept of decidability. And decidability usually is called the Entscheidungsproblem. My German's terrible, but it means decision problem of, can you create an algorithm, a series of steps to reduce that well-formed formula to bedrock, the axioms, and derive a truth value, or at least reach a decision. Yes, no, undecidable. They're closely related but different problems. So what the completeness theorem is basically saying, the incompleteness theorem, is that they have these things called Gödel encodings. So they use these clever numbers and these clever constructions. But basically what the proof says at its core is that if you have some formal system that does the kinds of things that we like in math, like arithmetic and first order logics and these things, the things that like make math useful and connected to reality, then what happens is that you always can construct something that's outside of the system in terms of your ability to derive a truth value for it. So in other words, however big your system gets, you need another axiom to be able to cover something. But the clever magic of Gödel was that the minute you add that, you can construct another thing with that axiom recursively that basically allows you to then create another statement that you can't prove. So you're always in a situation where you have stuff that's outside of your system. Now, for 70 plus years, this is a known result. Mathematicians accept it and they say, oh, well, that doesn't mean you can't have complete systems. Hilbert's formalization of geometry is a complete system. So that's fine. It just says that the way that math is constructed right now, we do not have completeness. Is that a problem? No, because these things that we can't talk about aren't meaningful for most mathematical conversations. And so most mathematicians study it and ignore it. It's a class you take. And then, oh, yeah, I learned about foundations of math. Yeah, there we go. You can talk about it at a cocktail party, but it's not meaningful. Then the philosophers got a hold of it and they said, this is why there's a difference between cognition and intelligence, consciousness and artificial intelligence. This is why man can never know the vastness of the universe. This is why we can never build perfect systems, because there are things that are beyond our comprehension. And Gödel proved this. It's like, he didn't say anything about that. Math is a language. It's a game. You set some rules up. There is a system of how you manipulate those rules, and they construct up the things. Just so happens that that game occasionally overlaps with physics, with real life stuff. And when it does, it's useful for real life things. But there's whole fields of math that don't connect to real life things and are utterly, utterly useless. And you can actually construct completely different rules for math. And there are mathematicians who do this. They're called set theorists. Woodin is one of them, Woodin. He is, omega set theory and these crazy things. And he tries to construct systems where the continuum hypothesis is false. A completely different rule set. And you can, with different rules, something that's true in ZFC set theory, standard mathematics, would not be true in a different set of rules. Is that okay? Sure. It's perfectly fine. It's constructed reality. Now, I'm very interested in this topic because at the Hoskinson Center for Formal Mathematics, the center that we set up at CMU, we're very interested in a branch of math called constructive mathematics. And we're very interested in what can you write down that can be machine understandable. Anything that lives in these weird Gödel realities of abstractions, because they can't be formulated in a formal system, it's very difficult for a computer to reason about them. So there's certain branches and areas of math that are intrinsically more difficult to describe in productive ways such that you can constructively get a proof that's machine verifiable. So yeah, it's useful from that side, from that standpoint, but it's useless from a philosophical viewpoint. I think you're barking up a completely wrong tree. There's a much more interesting tree, which is the gap of perception. How we cognate, how we think, how we perceive is not real relative to reality. There's a gap in reality from what we see and hear from what actually is happening. This is what you see and hear is a constructed reality that is the best your brain can process. And your brain can't process everything right. And so it fills in the gaps with extrapolations, but you're not actually seeing real reality. Cognitive neuroscience will tell you this, and there's plenty of great books written about it that float around. They say reality is a lie. So given that there's a gap, a perception gap between how it really is and what we perceive, that means that there's so much more beauty and nuance to the universe that if we could get extra perceptions, we would maybe be able to think in different ways. For example, human beings, we can't process four-dimensional reality. We can write it down in mathematical formulas and write books about it, and we can do art and kind of imagine what four-dimensional space would look like, but we don't think in 4D. We think in 3D. But if we had hyperspatial perception, maybe the universe would be a completely different animal to us. There are people who are born with completely different senses than our senses. Synesthesia is an example of that. So they perceive things differently. Music can be colors. Oh, that note is blue and that note is red, and C flat, C sharp is yellow. These types of things. Okay. And synesthesia people actually, if they're clever about it, a lot of them become memory champions because that extra dimension of perception is very useful in construction of memory palaces and other memory techniques that people use. There's a great book called Moonwalking with Einstein, and Wednesday is Indigo Blue, I think is what it's called. So Moonwalking Einstein is about memory, and Wednesday's Indigo Blue is about synesthesia. So it's an interesting thing. So I don't pay too much attention to it. There are plenty of books about this. Most of them are written by philosophers, not mathematicians. But, if you're really interested in the philosophy of mathematics and you want to go down that road, then what you ought to do is you ought to read lectures on the philosophy of mathematics by Joel David Hampkins. He's a professor at Oxford. Wonderful book, and it'll take you through a lot of this stuff.